What if the swastika had flown over London, Moscow, and Paris? What if Nazi Germany had not collapsed in 1945, but stood victorious, with its enemies defeated and its plans for Europe suddenly within reach? The answer is not a single alternate timeline. Hitler could have won in several different ways. Germany might have forced Britain into peace, defeated the Soviet Union, or simply secured control over continental Europe long enough to make its empire permanent. But in every version, victory would not have created a stable peace. It would have created a larger, more brutal war against millions of people who had been marked for removal, enslavement, or death. To understand this world, we have to start with what Germany actually wanted. The Nazi regime was not fighting only for territory or military prestige. Hitler imagined a racial empire stretching across Europe, built around German dominance. Eastern Europe was supposed to become Germany's colonial frontier. The plan was known as Lebensraum, or living space. In practice, it meant the destruction of independent states, the seizure of farmland and resources, and the displacement or murder of entire populations. The Holocaust was not an isolated crime carried out in secret. It was part of a wider system of racial conquest. Jews were targeted for extermination, while Slavs, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and many others faced persecution, forced labor, deportation, or death. So imagine that Germany avoids the disasters that eventually destroyed it. Perhaps Britain accepts a negotiated peace after France falls. Perhaps the German invasion of the Soviet Union succeeds before winter, before supply lines break, and before Soviet resistance can recover. Perhaps the United States remains officially outside the European war. In that world, Nazi Germany controls most of continental Europe. France is reduced to a dependent state, or divided into occupation zones. Poland has disappeared as an independent country. Czechoslovakia has already been dismantled. The Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway are ruled through occupation governments, collaborationist administrations, or direct military control. The first effect would be familiar: fear. There would be censorship, political arrests, secret police, executions, and a constant effort to destroy underground resistance. But Nazi rule would not look identical everywhere. Western Europe might receive a more flexible form of occupation, designed to keep factories operating and populations quiet. Eastern Europe would face something far harsher. The Nazi leadership viewed the lands of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia as the foundation of a German empire. Their resources would feed Germany. Their cities and industries would be reorganized for German use. Their populations would be driven out, enslaved, or killed. The war against the Soviet Union already revealed the intended pattern. Prisoners of war were starved. Civilians were deliberately targeted. Villages were destroyed in reprisal operations. Food was taken from occupied territories, even when that meant mass hunger. A German victory would have expanded this process across an enormous region. The Holocaust, meanwhile, would likely have continued and widened. Jewish communities in countries not yet fully occupied would face deportation and murder. The machinery of extermination would not simply stop because Germany had won. It would become easier to operate, with fewer armies approaching the camps and fewer governments able to resist German demands. But victory would not mean that the Nazis could instantly control everything they claimed. Their empire would be vast, divided, and permanently unstable. Germany would need soldiers, police, informers, collaborators, and local administrations across thousands of miles. Railways and roads would have to carry food, weapons, prisoners, and industrial supplies. Resistance groups would sabotage infrastructure, attack officials, and disappear into forests and mountains. The more territory Germany conquered, the more enemies it would create. Even countries that collaborated at first would have reasons to resist. Nationalists would oppose foreign rule. Communists would organize underground movements. Religious groups might reject Nazi control. Soldiers from defeated nations would become partisans. And many ordinary people would resist simply because their homes, families, and futures had been taken from them. This would make the Nazi Empire less like a peaceful superstate and more like a permanent military occupation. Now consider Britain. If Britain made peace, it would remain formally independent, but its freedom would be deeply limited. A government willing to cooperate with Germany might take power, while the empire and navy became bargaining chips. Britain could serve as a rival power on the edge of Europe, watching Germany dominate the continent. It might preserve its own institutions for a time, but under intense pressure to abandon Jewish refugees, suppress anti-Nazi activity, and accept German influence. If Britain continued fighting from overseas, Germany might never fully conquer the British Isles. But a victorious Germany could still force Britain into economic isolation, especially if the Mediterranean, Atlantic trade routes, and European industry were under German control. Across the Atlantic, the United States would face a difficult choice. A German victory in Europe would not automatically mean a Nazi invasion of America. Geography, naval power, and industrial distance would make that unlikely. But the United States would now confront a hostile authoritarian bloc controlling much of Europe and perhaps parts of the Middle East and Africa. The world might settle into a long Cold War between the United States, Nazi Germany, and possibly Japan. But it would not be a balanced Cold War like the one that followed our actual history. Germany would control more resources, more factories, and more strategic territory. Japan, meanwhile, might dominate much of East Asia if it also avoided defeat. That could produce a world divided among competing empires, each claiming the right to rule other peoples. Yet the alliance between Germany and Japan would not necessarily last. Their interests overlapped only temporarily. Germany wanted influence toward the Caucasus, the Middle East, and India. Japan wanted its own empire across Asia. Once their common enemies disappeared, rivalry would become more likely. And within Germany itself, victory could create new dangers. Hitler's system depended heavily on his personal authority. Nazi institutions were not designed for orderly succession. Different factions competed for influence: the military, the SS, the party bureaucracy, industrial leaders, and regional administrators. As long as Hitler remained alive, he could balance these groups. After his death, the question would be whether the empire became more bureaucratic, more military, or even more radical. A successor might try to stabilize German rule by reducing the most chaotic forms of terror. Another might double down on ideological conquest. Some territories might gain limited autonomy, while others would face intensified repression. But even a less fanatical successor would inherit a system built on violence. The central problem would remain: Nazi Germany could not easily become a normal nation-state, because its legitimacy depended on conquest and racial hierarchy. If it stopped expanding, it would still have to explain why millions had been robbed of their homes and rights. If it continued expanding, it would create new wars and new resistance. So would Hitler's victory have lasted for centuries? Probably not in the form he imagined. Empires can be powerful and still be fragile. The Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, and the Soviet Union all controlled enormous territories, yet each faced the basic problem of ruling people who did not consent to their rule. A Nazi victory might have delayed the liberation of Europe by decades. It might have killed millions more. It might have reshaped borders, languages, economies, and memories across the world. But it would not have erased opposition. The most important lesson of this scenario is that military victory and historical success are not the same thing. Hitler could perhaps have won battles, conquered capitals, and forced governments to surrender. But he could not make an empire based on terror become legitimate. He could not turn hatred into stability, and he could not permanently control a continent by destroying the people who lived in it. In the end, a Nazi victory would not have produced a peaceful 1,000-year Reich. It would have produced a frightened, militarized empire, haunted by resistance, divided by rival factions, and built on crimes too immense to conceal forever. The darkest alternate history is not a world where evil wins and everything ends. It is a world where evil wins and everyone else has to keep fighting.